In the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and through the 1960s, many consumers loved American vehicles. There really wasn't much competition in the marketplace in the U.S. aside from domestic competition. You could take your pick of a vehicle from GM, Ford, Chrysler. There wasn't yet American Motors in the 1940s or 30s, but there was Nash and Hudson that would later merge to form American Motors, Packard, Studebaker, and a host of other auto companies at that time. And American consumers were, by and large, impressed and pleased with the vehicles that they were driving. But something started to change as the American auto industry hit the 1970s, and particularly as time would go on into the 1980s. And more specifically, there were a number of vehicles that the various domestic auto companies would introduce that would really sour Americans' taste on buying domestic vehicles for, in some cases, the rest of the potential customer's lifetime. There were some vehicles that were produced that were just so bad and got such bad publicity that, unfortunately, it really helped sink the American auto industry. And it's something that arguably the American auto industry never recovered from. Today, the market share of the big three remains relatively low compared to what it was several decades prior. And in all likelihood, it's not going to come back. But what were those vehicles that really created this precipitous drop in market share? Let's examine them and look at the top 5 vehicles that unfavorably changed Americans' perceptions of their own domestic auto industry. Let's begin with number 5. And at number 5, we have the 1979 Chrysler Rbody cars. Now, the Rbody cars, as mentioned, were introduced in 1979 and had an extremely brief run in the sales department from only 1979 to 1981, just 3 model years. In fact, some of the Rbody models, like the Plymouth Grand Fury, were only around for 2 model years, 1980 and 81. Other Rbody models, like the Chrysler Newport and the Chrysler New Yorker and the Dodge St. Regis, were around for all 3. So why do the Rbodies make this list? Well, first of all, this was effectively a warmed-over B-body platform, and the B-body was introduced by Chrysler in 1962. And remember, at this point, Chrysler just didn't have a lot of capital to invest to come up with new platforms. So it warmed over that B-body platform and introduced these relatively large vehicles at a time when oil prices were spiking in the U.S. market. Now, remember that GM had downsized their full-size vehicles in 1977 and did so rather successfully. Customers ended up liking the smaller and more compact size. Ford and Chrysler stuck with their extremely large full-size automobiles all the way through to 1978 and would take until 1979 for Ford to introduce the Panther platform cars and for Chrysler to introduce the R-bodies. But the unfortunate thing about the R-body was that not only was the styling relatively dated, but also a good fraction of the engineering was dated, as I mentioned. And unfortunately, the quality control on these cars was abysmal. They were outfitted under hood with lean burn electronic feedback carburetor systems that didn't necessarily run right, at least part of the time, including this strange box on the air cleaner under hood that was effectively the brains of the unit. Why Chrysler would put a computer under hood in an area where it's subject to lots of thermal cycles is beyond me. Obviously, most automakers would put the electronic control modules inside the vehicle and have wiring going inside the car, but Chrysler did not. And that created some reliability issues, but also the electrical systems in these cars were just not up to the task. In fact, some journalists tested these vehicles at the time and remarked that when they would step on the brakes, the interior lights would come on or the clock would go off. It just was really a mess. In fact, during this time period, Chrysler also had the tooling brake for one of their torsion bars on the front suspension. And as a consequence, they just gave the cars 2 left or 2 right torsion bars. And that would seemingly sound okay, but the problem is the car obviously has different weights on the driver's side versus the passenger side, and the torsion bars were originally tailored to said weight. And of course, if you just put two lefts or two rights on, that's not going to be the case. So the cars didn't ride as well either. Chrysler just didn't have the money to replace the torsion bar tooling. So the Rbodies were really this stopgap measure, and they were not successful. Kind of lived in the shadow of GM's downsizing from 1977, but they had considerably more gremlins and quality control issues, including the lean burn setups under hood, and for that reason, it makes number 5 on this list. Let's move on to number 4. And at number 4, we have the Ford Pinto, and let's not forget the Mercury Bobcat. The Pinto was introduced for the 1971 model year, produced through the 1980 model year, and I have to say, by and large, it was a decent little compact car. It wasn't horrible by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it was relatively reliable, relatively well built. This was an economy car, after all. One of the things that it was cursed with was rust. And it had halfway decent engines in it. Some of them were a little quirky, and engines like the Cologne V6, as an example, and some Pintos were a bit of oil leakers. But they were generally relatively reliable, especially when we compare them to other vehicles that are on this list. Now, the Pinto had two Achilles heels. One was rust. These cars, seemingly, you'd breathe on them and they would begin to rust. And that was somewhat typical of other cars of the era too, so that wasn't necessarily a distinguishing feature. But what was the publicity surrounding Ford and a particular cost-benefit analysis that was performed by Ford, wherein it was revealed that Ford recognized that the Pinto had an ability to self-immolate in the event of a rear-end collision. And the fix for this was an $11 part that would basically provide extra strength in the event of a rear-end collision. Well, $11 per car is relatively expensive, and a cost-benefit memo became publicized where Ford compared the cost of outfitting the Pintos with this $11 part or series of components and compared that to the cost of paying out against various claims related to serious burns or deaths. And Ford had calculated that they would have 180 deaths, 180 serious burns, and the net cost of just paying out in those cases was far less than the cost to install the hardware required in the Pinto to preclude such adverse events. Now, as you can imagine, the American public was outraged that Ford would think about this in such a rational and calculating manner. And the reputational damage that Ford incurred from this was severe and continued for many, many years. The unfortunate part, like I said, and why the Pinto only made it to number 4 on this list is because despite the publicity, the car actually wasn't a horrible car, especially when you think about the other compacts that were around at the time, like the Chevrolet Vega or the AMC Gremlin. I would have picked the Gremlin, by the way. Proven technology, AMC's inline 6-cylinder engine, Chrysler torque flight, at least after the Borg-Warner automatic was dropped in the early 1970s. And, that was kind of a proven car and a good-looking car. The Gremlin was great looking. But in any case, the Pinto was not a bad vehicle, but the publicity that ensued from it just overtook its reputation as being a decent little compact car and turned a lot of customers away from American vehicles. Let's move on to number 3. And at number 3, we have the 1976 Aspen and Valari. Now, the Aspen and Valari were introduced by Chrysler for the 1976 model year and succeeded the Plymouth Valiant and Dodge Dart. And Chrysler had conceived the Aspen-Valari duo as a car, like a compact car that effectively could be a just regular old compact car, but also be dressed up as a more luxurious vehicle. It was a good premise, especially for the time in which some consumers were concerned about fuel economy. The problem with the Aspen and Valari was that it became the most recalled car up until that point. There were so many problematic issues associated with it. First was the drivability. I already mentioned the lean burn setup on the R-body Chryslers, And it was still bad by that point, but a few years prior on these Aspen and Valaris, that lean burn setup was known for causing stalling and drivability issues. In fact, Chrysler, I believe in 1977, issued a recall on 1.3 million vehicles because of drivability issues. They just were not drivable. They would stall out, you'd go around corners, and you basically have to be ready to shift the car into neutral and restart it and then pop it back into drive. They also had myriad issues like the seat belts becoming detached in high deceleration events. Obviously, that's not a good thing because then you have unbelted occupants. There were, in some cases, misrouted fuel vapor lines that could come into contact with the alternator belt and then cause a fire under hood. That was not good either. Then there were the brake lines, which were routed under the battery tray, and battery acid could drip on them, so that would rot out the brake lines, and you would not have any brakes in your vehicle. Then there was the possibility of the front subframe becoming detached, the likelihood that the secondary hood latch was not strong enough to keep the hood closed in the event that the primary latch had failed, and the fact that Chrysler did not install the inner wheelhouses in these vehicles. Chrysler didn't learn their lesson from the 1957 cars, which rusted prematurely, and the same happened to the Aspen and Valari. So the cars rusted, they weren't that drivable, they had tons of drivability issues, they didn't have, let's say, the appropriate safety gear in some instances. Like I mentioned, the seat belts that would unlatch themselves. And so for all these reasons, what was really a good premise of a vehicle and a lot of the core componentry, like the engines and transmissions in the Aspen and Valari, aside from the lean burn portion of the engine, they actually were well-engineered, well-built engines. The Slant 6 is an example, or any of the Chrysler V8s that you could get under hood. Good engines, but that lean burn setup just was not well-engineered and perhaps introduced prematurely. And you couple that with all those other recalls, and this being the most recalled car to date, people ended up hating their Aspen Valari, and it just turned them off from not only Chrysler, but in some cases, American cars. And that's the reason why this makes it to number 3 on the list. Let's move on to number 2. And at number 2, we have the GM X cars, which were introduced for the 1980 model year. Now, the GM X cars were, as I said, introduced for the 1980 model year. They came out partway through 1979. And initially, they were extremely successful. In fact, Chevrolet sold over 800,000 citations in the 1980 model year alone. The car was a runaway hit. It was the perfect combination of, can you say this today, style. They actually weren't bad-looking cars, but the style was right. The packaging was great. If you've ever sat in one of these cars, they are very roomy on the inside, despite the fact that they are small vehicles. So they were the right size. They looked good. They generally drove well. They had relatively good road isolation in them. They were relatively quiet, especially for the time frame. Well, maybe except the 2.5-liter Iron Duke engine under hood, which people know what my opinion is of that if you've been watching this channel for some time. Although these cars did have an optional 2.8-liter V6 engine. But the problem with the X cars was that, much like the Aspen Valari, which was the most recalled car to date, the X cars surpassed the Aspen and Valari as the most recalled cars to date. And they had so many issues. They, just like the Aspen Valari, had drivability issues. Remember, this was the days of electronic feedback carburetors, and it wouldn't be until the 1982 model year that any of the X cars would get some form of fuel injected, and in those cases only on the 4 cylinders. The V6 would remain carbureted through the entire run. And the drivability issues were one major problem. Then the power steering racks would get so-called morning sickness, where they would become hard to turn. The seals would internally wear out. In fact, this was such a common failure on not only the X cars, but almost any GM front-wheel drive vehicle of the time. The X cars, the J cars like the Cavalier, even the C cars in 1985, like the Olds 98 and Buick Electra and Cadillac Fleetwood, the A cars that came out in 1982, like the Chevy Celebrity, they all had this issue with the steering racks. And it was almost impossible to get them replaced because there were no parts. Every car needed a replacement steering rack. It was just terrible. Then there were issues with, on the manual transmission X cars, the parking brake release would pull through the underside of the dash. It just wasn't secured appropriately. But the most egregious of all the X car issues was the rear brake system that would prematurely lock. And it wasn't just the fact that these cars had challenges with their brake systems, but that GM fought it and fought the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration in terms of recalling the cars. First, they just recalled some early manual transmission vehicles. Then they recalled, I believe, all manual transmission vehicles and some early automatic transmission vehicles. They never actually recalled the entire population of X cars. And when they did recall them, the fix was a new proportioning valve that even internal GM documents showed that wouldn't necessarily fix the issue, or at least engineers were doubtful that it would. And so because of all the recalls and the issues, the X car really just ended up turning off, again, a lot of customers to American vehicles and GM vehicles. And as the more I think about it, the more issues I can come up with on the X cars too. Everything from, as I mentioned already, the power steering racks and the rear brake issues. But the window regulators would fail. These had tape drive window regulator mechanisms that would frequently snap, and then the door glass would fall into the door. The interior trim bits would come off. The hubcaps wouldn't remain secure on the base level Chevrolet Citations. It just really was kind of a mess in terms of the vehicles, which is so unfortunate because if you drive one of the X cars that is in good tune and has everything working well, it actually is a pleasant little car to drive. The ergonomics are well thought out. The packaging inside is amazing for the time. There's great trunk space in the car. There's great passenger space and roominess. The seats are comfortable, extremely comfortable, by the way. The doors are so thin that gives you a lot more interior room. They really had about 95% of everything right, but unfortunately that last 5% was so vital and it ended up dooming the X car. And for that reason, the sales just plummeted each year after the first year of introduction. The Citation sold 800,000 units the first year. The next year it sold only 400,000, then 200,000. It just kept basically divide by 2 each year thereafter, and you can conclude the Citation's sales curve. Now, it also tells you something that GM knew they had a problem because they would rebadge the Citation 2 after several model years in an effort to convince the buying public that it was different and improved. But of course, it really wasn't materially improved. And the amazing thing is the A-body cars that would come out in 1982 were effectively warmed over X-platform cars with a little extra length. And those would become extremely successful and not known for recalls. They actually ended up being known in general for their reliability and durability, at least once you get to the A-body cars that were produced, I would say, from 1986 and later. Those ended up being halfway decent. GM actually really did improve their quality in the late 1980s, and the 1988-89 model year cars and 1990 model year cars, for example, are measurably better than the early 1980s cars. But alas, for the X cars, it was too little, too late. Let's move on to number 1. And at number 1, we have the Chevrolet Vega. And I guess you can throw in the Pontiac Astra as well. The Vega was introduced for the 1971 model year, would continue through to 1977. And the unfortunate part about the Vega was that it was such a promising little car. It looked great. It looked like a mini Camaro. The stylist did a wonderful job on that early Vega. The looks didn't necessarily improve as the model years went on, really in part because of the bumper standards that would go into effect for the 1973 model year in the front and the 1974 model year on the front and rear of the vehicles. But the little Vega was a great-looking car, and it was initially a great seller. The problem, though, was, well, I shouldn't say the problem. The problems were myriad with the Vega. In particular, they rusted faster than just about any other compact. on the market or any other vehicle. And beyond the rust, the main issue with the Vegas was what was under hood. More specifically, the 2.3-liter aluminum block cast iron head 4-cylinder engine. Now, this little engine had so much promise. It was an overhead cam design. It wasn't overly powerful, but it also wasn't a slouch for the time, particularly in the compact car space. But the aluminum block that did not have cast iron cylinder liners in it proved to be an extreme problem for Vega owners. And it was the design of that aluminum block engine that did not have those liners that would give buyers a lot of trouble. More specifically, there were a few faults with this engine. It was an open deck aluminum block design, and the cylinder bores could potentially rock back and forth a little bit because there wasn't a great amount of structure to keep them in place, and that sometimes caused sealing issues with the head gasket, especially when coupled with the fact that you had aluminum for the block material and cast iron for the head material, which expanded and contracted at different rates. Never a great proposition to have dissimilar metals kind of mating up in one place unless you have great gasketing material, and the head gasket wasn't necessarily up to the task. And the fact that the car didn't have cast iron cylinder liners was a problem as well, because if the engine ever overheated, what tended to happen was that the pistons would basically permanently etch the cylinder walls, and then the car would become an oil burner thereafter. Moreover, the car did sometimes have a tendency to overheat because Chevrolet outfitted it with a radiator that was about the size of 1 foot by 1 foot. Very, very small overall. And when Chevrolet was testing the Vega engines, the first step in the test procedure was to ensure that all fluids were full. Well, as you can imagine, that most buyers and drivers of these Vegas didn't pop their hood frequently. And so when they would run a little bit low on coolant, well, then you'd had a significantly reduced amount of cooling capacity in the system, and the cars would have a tendency to overheat. This was also during the time frame where, at least on the initial model years, the cars didn't have an overflow tank. So coolant would burp out, as an example, in some cases, or the water would evaporate out of it, and you would be left with less coolant and less heat transfer capabilities than what the car was intended to have. And like I said, the cars would overheat, and they would become oil burners. There were also issues with valve stem seals that would cause them to become oil burners. And the engine was really just a mess. Now, it became such a mess that in the latter years of the Vega, Chevrolet would try to rebrand the engine after some improvements, the Durabuilt 2300 engine, to signify that they had made those improvements. But again, it was just too late. There were a lot of other funky things on the Vega too, that like the air cleaner that you had to replace the entire housing. You couldn't just replace the paper element unless you bought an aftermarket filter or you cut it open and kind of recrimped the air cleaner housing. That would be something that GM would employ on a couple other vehicles too, like the Chevettes. But it really began here with the Vega. So the combination of the rust issues and the reliability of the engine in particular under hood just doomed the Vega. And as a consequence, what appeared to be a beautiful little car ended up being a nightmare for many, many people. And beyond the issues I mentioned, the Vega sometimes also had an issue. There was a recall for the rear axle separating from the body. It just was a recalled car, a glitchy car. I mentioned the rust already, but the rust was actually the result in part of a problem with the dipping process that GM was employing for anti-corrosion inhibitors, where there was an air gap as the bodies would go through this dip and get submerged. And there was a good portion of the body that just wouldn't get touched with that anti-corrosion inhibitors. And that just accelerated the rust problems. So the Vega is number one on the list because the engine in particular and the rust issues were so bad that it turned Americans off of compact cars for many, many years to come, and something that the American auto companies just never recovered from. So that's the list. I will say there's a couple honorable mentions here. The first would be anything with an Oldsmobile diesel engine in it. The Oldsmobile diesels were introduced in 1978 and then ran through 1985. They made 3 different variants of the diesels: a 5.7-liter 350 cubic inch V8 diesel, a 4.3-liter V8 diesel, and a 4.3-liter V6 diesel. And in particular, the early model years before GM would go to the DX block on the 5.7-liter, they had a lot of issues, mostly with head bolts stretching because they used the same number of head bolts as the gasoline engines. That would blow the head gasket. Well, and you know what would happen from there. Not good things. So that's an honorable mention. Another honorable mention, I would say, is the Chevy Corvair, where Ralph Nader obviously wrote his book, Unsafe at Any Speed, about the Corvair and its handling abilities and how twitchy it was because it was rear engine, had a lot of weight in the rear, and it had a swing arm rear suspension design. The reason I didn't put the Corvair higher on this list was the car was actually decently reliable, and I think that some of the handling, let's say criticism, was overblown. They are a bit twitchy, particularly in the early model years, but a rear swing arm suspension was something that was not uncommon during the day. In fact, Volkswagens used it with a rear engine design too. So I would actually say the Corvair was a halfway decent car. It was, maybe the suspension could have been revised a bit and the twitchiness could have been revised so that it wasn't so twitchy. But overall, it was a halfway decent car, I have to say, and pretty reliable. A lot of owners ended up liking them. And I don't think that necessarily did the damage, as an example, that the Vega did, where the engine just was completely unreliable and the car rusted almost from the minute that you brought it home from the showroom. But what do you think? Put a comment in the comment section. Did I get it right? Did I get the ordering right? Did I miss something? Let me know what you think. Thanks again for watching.